Welcome, everyone. Let me just pull up some slides. Hopefully, everybody's having a good Friday or maybe a very late Friday, depending upon where you're at.
So before we begin, I wanted to remind people that you can't use the chat to communicate with us. So please use the Q&A, both for questions in terms of access content questions, or just to let us know that things are working. Thank you.
Okay, so before we begin, I'd like to introduce myself and also Ken Berard. So again, thank you for joining today. I know it's Friday. It's a hard day. We're all tired on Friday. But what we wanted to talk about today is an area of condensed matter physics. So I know a lot of the school is focused on other areas of high energy and astrophysics. But believe it or not, we have a lot of machine learning that we do throughout condensed matter physics today. I can go into lots of details. Feel free to ask questions at any point. Two of the key areas that we're interested in condensed matter for machine learning is really being able to predict new kinds of phases and behaviors. But also the other area, which we'll talk about today, is being able to accelerate the solutions of different kinds of equations that we've historically solved using different kinds of physics and mathematical methods. So in condensed matter, the core problem that we're interested in is really solving what we call the electronic structure problem. This is the problem of what are electrons doing to give rise to the properties of molecules, materials, and other kinds of objects. And this problem, really dates back to the beginning of quantum mechanics. As Dirac put it, we know exactly that we have to solve the Schrodinger equation. We can discuss, what perturbations to the Schrodinger equation should be solved for different things. But fundamentally, if we want to understand materials, we have to solve the Schrodinger equation. But solving that equation has been a historically difficult problem. It turns out if you want to solve it exactly, it scales exponentially with system size and the number of electrons. And what that practically means is if you want to solve it exactly, you basically can't do it for more than H2 or hydrogen itself. And so it becomes very, very difficult to solve a variety of different problems. So today we'll talk about some methods for that, and we'll talk about how we can also use machine learning to improve those methods. Maybe Ken can introduce himself, and then I'll talk a little bit more about myself and my research, and then dive into the topic.
Yeah, so my name's Kenneth Berard. I am in Brenda's group, and my research is focusing on accelerating these methods that we use to solve the Schrodinger equation in different ways. And of course, related to this winter school here, we'll be talking about using machine learning. So yeah, I'll be presenting the majority, I think, of the notebook and talking you through some of my current research and how those methods can be used to accelerate these stochastic many-body methods that Brenda will introduce here.
Yeah, and I should say just for background, so Ken is a graduate student. He actually started his graduate career at Stony Brook, moved over to Brown. I joke around, but Ken has probably more master's degrees than me. Ken has degrees in chemistry, data science, and now he's working on biomedical engineering. So if you want to talk to Ken about master's degrees or fellowships, which he has quite a few of, you can also ask him. Um, so just to give you a little bit of background about what my group does, which is somewhat representative of what goes on in condensed matter. So my group is interested in three main foci. So we work on what's called quantum statistical mechanics, which we'll touch upon today. And the basic idea there, most of our work there is about how do we solve the Schrodinger equation faster and more accurately. So the methods we'll talk about today are incredibly accurate. That's because if you want to understand things like superconductivity, the energy scales involved there are incredibly, incredibly small. We like to joke around in electronic structure that we're some of the most accurate methods. We make them some of the most accurate methods that people want, that we care about the 6 decimal place. But, in many cases, we actually do. It makes the difference between, let's say, a superconductor and let's say something called a charge density wave or a spin density wave. We can go through lots of different phases. But there's a lot of low energy physics that we need to get right. And so our group works on methods that try to get this right faster and more accurately. And that tends to take a combination of quantum mechanics and statistical mechanics. So years ago, when I did this, what the statistical mechanics really meant was doing things called Monte Carlo sampling. So coming up with different ways of sampling what electrons do. Nowadays, it's now grown into a much larger field of looking at machine learning. And I like to remind people it's sort of funny. So I come from the I worked for many years on methods called quantum Monte Carlo methods, which we'll talk about. But those are exactly the methods that have spun out quantum computing and have spun out machine learning. So people who originally worked on those methods, we sort of joke, everybody, people start in quantum Monte Carlo and then they end up doing something bigger in some other area. Most modern machine learning that people have been doing in physics and chemistry also came from quantum Monte Carlo methods because of the statistical nature. But all of quantum computing is many senses, the algorithms we use right now exactly are translations of quantum Monte Carlo. So I can talk about that more later. We also work on computational biophysics, and there we're very much interested in trying to understand protein and RNA conformational dynamics and how that leads to diseases. So in short, if you're not familiar with biology, the idea is if you have a protein and it adopts, let's say, 7 different structures with different probabilities, now if the distribution of those structures is changed, now you get disease or potentially aging. And so we want to be able to understand that. And to be honest with you, experiment can't really tell you that. Certainly experiments in the body cannot tell you that. And so we try to do that computationally, which again requires both machine learning and physics. So for example, recently we developed a way of using AlphaFold to predict the conformations of full proteins. Originally, people used AlphaFold to predict one structure of a protein. That's what AlphaFold is for. It's for the lowest energy structure. But we sort of came up with ways of hacking AlphaFold to predict whole ensembles, and now this is kind of a whole field of itself. And lastly, we do a lot of, I'll call alternative computing, which is quantum, molecular, and biocomputing. We like to hack different physical substrates and make them compute. What this matters for your school is we do a lot of quantum computing for materials and also for biomolecules. So there are whole sets of my group that take quantum algorithms and apply them to quantum materials for the first time and for biomolecules for the first time. And like I said, a lot of the techniques in quantum computing that we're certainly using in near-term quantum computing are literally quantum Monte Carlo techniques. Like the same people made them. We use exactly the same things, to be honest with you. All right. So what I'm going to go through before we hit the notebook is just some background on what and why we're doing. I'll give you a little bit of the condensed matter perspective and just a little perspective on the algorithms. I don't want to talk too much. So again, if you have any questions, please just let me know. And in the notebook, which should be in the folder, we can maybe Ken or someone else can share the link in the chat. I've also listed some key papers in case you're curious about this. What are stochastic methods, and why do we care? What's the whole issue? So the reason why I'm here, and what I'll say is that condensed matter is one of the biggest areas of physics, and that is because of the fact that condensed matter basically determines all the kinds of materials that go into all the devices that you care about. So if you think about devices like batteries and photovoltaics, we've increasingly made better and better batteries and better photovoltaics because we were able to understand the physics of materials and then change those materials in different ways so that they give us the properties that we want. So for example, in the case of batteries, many of you may know that most recently people have been interested in lithium ion batteries and some of the issues with lithium ion batteries. To design those batteries, we have to understand, what does the lithium oxide, the different lithium compounds do? What do the electrolytes do? What do those molecules do? And what should we use for cathodes? And so doing that requires designing new materials. In recent years, people have thought a lot about 2D materials as being useful for batteries. And in fact, many batteries now use different 2D materials. And so in order to make batteries with, let's say, higher energy densities, better discharge rates, you have to understand the materials that go into them. It's the same thing for photovoltaics. Photovoltaics, what we generally try to do is we're trying to beat the Shockley quasar limit, try to get the most basically pairs of electrons and separate them as possible. Yeah, Jan.
There's a question in the chat about the definition of information in terms of quantum and molecular computing. I assume will you mention this when you get to focus 3?
We're not going to return to focus 3, so let me just take that now. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for the question. Great question. What is information in those senses? So I'll start with the simpler case of molecular computing. So molecular computing, what we've been working on there is basically making computers out of molecules. And I just want to be clear, that's different than what has been done in the past. A lot of times people model computers or model molecules using computers. What we're doing is we're actually making computers from molecules. And so there are two main ways that we define information for molecules, if you're going to use molecules as your storage medium. So the first way, which preceded me and many of my collaborators at Brown that worked on this problem, is using polymers. So if you think about in your body, you have DNA, you have RNAs, you have lots of polymers in your body, and the way that they store information is in their sequence. So you have a long DNA strand, let's say, and you have four canonical base pairs. Um, you can take, log base 2 of 4. So each of those base pairs is a possibility in a slot. And so that means that basically every base pair you have in DNA is 2 bits. So 2 bits of information, 2 bits of information every single time you know a specific base pair. So in a polymer, the sequence, the order of the base pairs you have is one form of information. So that's always been there. And just so that you know, your body has about 2 gigabytes of information if you just take one set of DNA, your genome, once, not caring about RNAs or other things. What we came up with actually at Brown, and this was a project between engineering and chemistry and biology at Brown, is we came up with a way of storing information in the disordered sequence of molecules. So instead of having a long polymer strand, what you can do is you can take a solution and you can say that every unique molecule is a bit. And if that molecule is there, that's a 1. If it's not there, it's a 0. And then you can mix a bunch of molecules together. And that's like a simple scheme. There are much better, more compact ways of doing it. But that's a simple scheme for storing information. It turns out, and I guess we were the first people to really sit down and think about it. Our body does both. So we have DNA, but then we also have random other molecules. Your metabolites, things you eat. That's all information. It just turns out that really people really haven't fully appreciated all that information yet, in part because of the technology, in part because it's kind of invasive. But like we, in principle, if we know all, your DNA, your RNA, those other molecules, we can tell you about your aging, your environmental exposure, and that should tell you, in some sense, the trajectory of your life. We're getting there, but we're not there yet. In terms of quantum information, we store that information typically in qubits. The exact form of qubits, which are quantum bits, depends upon how they're implemented. So in the most common quantum computers, which are superconducting qubit-based quantum computers, there are different states of the superconductors, depends on exactly what kind of qubit you're talking about, that will basically store superposition of a 0 and 1. So it turns out there are 3 different types of superconducting qubits that store information based on their phase or their flux, if you know superconductors. And so you can store information there. A simpler picture, which I guess one of my students just got grabbed up, stolen from me, is to work on atoms and ions. And there you can either use their electronic states, so you can store information in whether the electron's in one state or the other state, or you can use their hyperfine states, which are another type of quantum state to store information. So there are a few ways in quantum computing, and to be honest with you, the leader is superconducting qubits, and maybe the follower is ions or atoms, trapped ions and atoms. But there are a lot of other ways too, and so some other people would definitely argue with me about what's best. But basically, you just need superposition of 2 quantum states. Yeah, just interrupt me if you do have any questions. So I'm going to delve into this focus one a little bit, and that's what we'll do with the notebook. So the other thing I was just saying is we care about materials and we care about their design because we want to make different devices. They could be batteries, they could be photovoltaics, they could be other things. And historically, the way that people did that is they did that with lots and lots of experimentation. So I used to joke around back in the day that one material meant 40 graduate students working all at the same time, really, really hard, testing different things. That was our old form of data. Graduate student tests this and tests that, tests the other thing. Obviously, that's really expensive, requires a lot of people. And a lot of times, if you just do experiments, you don't necessarily know why did things work without maybe using some other techniques. And so the newer way of doing things is using what we call computer-aided design. I say newer because, as we'll talk about in a minute, the newest way is using machine learning. When we talk about computer-aided materials design, what that means is we're trying to solve equations of physics and some mathematical equations in order to design a material and to predict different kinds of materials. And so historically, that's been solving the Schrodinger equation and a few other equations, and maybe the Dirac equation if relativity matters. And by solving that, we can predict basic properties. And we've gotten to the point, as I'll briefly discuss, where our methods are very good. They're not perfect, they're not exact, as I was saying at the beginning, but they're very good. And so we can predict a lot of properties pretty readily. The problem with this is that this costs a lot of compute time. And so I'm not joking about that. So whenever I talk at different universities or talk to their administration, they always kind of joke around that ML is going to take up all of our compute time. Well, people like me and people like Ken, Ken spent a lot of time at the DOE National Labs. We've been running for 30 years, huge simulations. In fact, I think it's over about 30% of all of the supercomputing time in the United States is used on materials calculations, because those calculations, if you want really high accuracy, can be extremely expensive. So some of the methods I'll talk about today, we parallelize across what we call leadership computing, which is computing in the United States. It's our biggest machines. We parallelize them across, thousands to millions of cores, and then we get our answers back. Of course, we don't necessarily have to do that, but historically things have been very, very expensive if you really want to do big things with high accuracy. And so the newest way, which we'll talk about, is machine learning. So if we want to cut down on the costs, you could do smaller simulations, but if you want like really subtle quantum phases, they are very sensitive to system size. That's called finite size effects. And so instead, what we've been all trying to do, not just my group, many groups, is trying to inject machine learning into the loop. So as one example, years ago, when people wanted to understand different materials, they would run a calculation for the first material and then run a calculation for the second material, run a calculation for the third, and basically they'd have no relation. But what we've learned is, if the materials are slightly different or maybe their geometries are slightly different, what we can do is we can train on, let's say, the first simulations so that ML can try to predict the second and the third and the fourth. And it might sound silly, but in a lot of cases, for example, sometimes people care about the dynamics of the electrons in a material or the atoms in a material. If you want to do the dynamics, then you have to like repeatedly solve the electronic problem, which is expensive. And years ago, people would literally do that. So they would solve the problem for one geometry, then maybe the material moves a little bit, and then they solve it for another, and then it moves a little bit, and then we solve it for another. That was incredibly expensive. What machine learning lets us do is we can train models once and then let them predict between all of the other points, all the little moves so that we don't have to keep recalculating things. So that's a huge thing in the field right now. Another huge thing is we're also trying to train, we'll talk about something called density functional theory. We're trying to train the universal functional. So Google and some other DeepMind and other companies are working on this, where this functional will predict the Schrodinger equation for everything. And people theorized about this since 1960, but nobody's been ever able to do it. I'm not sure that machine learning will give us the universal functional for real, but it will give us maybe a good functional. So I can talk about that later. So anyway, we've gone from experimentation to computing, where computing used to be computing long physical equations, to now machine learning as sort of the third round of materials prediction. So why does materials prediction take so much time? What's hard about it? The things that are very, very hard for materials prediction are what we call truly quantum materials. You might ask, what do I mean by a quantum material as maybe as opposed to a classical material? So quantum material is a material where quantum mechanics actually matters. So I can't just do Newton's laws or something like this on the material. Wave functions really matter. You have to solve the wave function for the material to get its property. So examples of this, one of the older examples that people know about are high temperature superconductors, which were made of TMOs. Those are called transition metal oxides. So these are materials that have a transition metal like ruthenium and then some oxygens. And it turns out that these transition metal oxides are incredibly complicated. The way their electronic structure works, the phases that they have. That's why the first high temperature superconductors were basically transition metal oxides. So these are very, very, very hard to describe, it turns out. Their energy scales can be very, very subtle. Another class of materials where it can be hard to simulate are different kinds of 2D materials, quantum heterostructures. Not all of them. So you might say, oh, graphene's a 2D material. It's not hard to simulate graphene. It turns out to be quite easy. What is hard is if you make a graphene heterostructure. So if you ever heard of heterostructures, these are kind of like in the picture, these are materials where you put multiple layers of a 2D material together, and then maybe you twist them, you crinkle them, you create an interesting mixture between them. So those heterostructures are known to have very exotic properties, even just looking at graphene. So if you look at twisted, you may have heard of like twisted bilayer graphene and its magic angle. Understanding the physics of that is incredibly hard once we get close to these magic twisting angles. And so those are very hard quantum simulations. Happy to go on about that. It's still kind of an open, it's not open, but it's a difficult problem that many of us are trying to deal with. And it gets even harder when you start looking at things like MOS2, WSE2. So these are transition metal dichalcogenides that also have a lot of spin orbit coupling. So heavier metals will start making this problem even harder. And then lastly, quantum materials that contain lanthanides and actinides, as you might not be surprised to hear, are very hard. So if you're really interested in uranium and plutonium, those still remain very challenging problems. I'll put it that way. And if you're curious and you've never looked it up, look at plutonium's phase diagram. It is absolutely insane, and nobody can predict it, to be honest with you. So these are very hard problems. And so these require very high accuracy methods. And so you might ask why. So some of you may have heard, I mentioned the term density functional theory before. This was one of the first real electronic structure theories that people could apply to lots of materials. It was developed by Walter Cohen, who received the 1998 Nobel Prize. He was actually a mathematician at Courant in the 50s, and he really just wanted to prove a few things about the electronic ground state. So he wrote down these proofs, and everybody said, that's great, and kind of, haha, wouldn't look at it for 25, 30 years. And then 30 years later, when computers became good, some people said, why don't we actually like try to solve his equations? And so that gave rise to the theory of what's called density functional theory. And what this theory does is it basically says that you can solve for the electron density of a material. So the density is where are the electrons on average in the material. And it comes up with a self-consistent loop. So you kind of guess a density, and then you do some calculations. They give you a new density, and you iterate that loop. And so this theory self-consistently solves for the electron density of a material. If you've ever heard of mean field theories, this is what's called a mean field theory. So in classical stat mech or in quantum stat mech, you may have heard of mean field theories. Density functional theory is a mean field theory. And so it ends up being very quick to compute, at least by today's standards. And so as a result of that, almost everybody in physics and chemistry and applied math will use this theory to describe materials. You see on the right, this is a plot from one of my friends at UC Merced. She decided to map this out in kilopapers. I think we're probably in, do we call it millipapers? We're in many millions of papers at this point that use DFT. In fact, I think most people in physics and chemistry would say if you want to publish an experimental result, you probably have to run a DFT calculation to back it up. This theory is great, but like I said, it's a mean field theory, so it does not get really small energy scales right. It's not accurate enough to tell you if something's really a superconductor or not. So you have to go in and do better theories. And that's because electrons end up being what we call correlated in many systems. So what density functional theory, what a mean field theory assumes is that if you have electrons, these E's, that they really don't talk to each other. It's just they kind of move around and everything's an average of how they behave. Um, and that works in many cases, but in many important cases with these transition metals and some quantum materials, the electrons don't behave independently. They're correlated. If one, let's say, moves, then another moves. If one's in one state, the other moves to a different state. And so this is much harder to describe. And this definitely happens whenever you have D and F electrons. Sometimes it happens if you have what we call p electrons, but usually it's when you have these transition metals involved in some way. Uh, and so the methods we'll show you will show you allow you to go beyond this density functional theory and to we'll show you how to do it with machine learning. So just to give you a sense of like why this matters, this is one example from our group. We've worked on lots of quantum materials over the years. This is the material chromium triiodide. It was actually the first 2D ferromagnet that people discovered. So it's atomically thin, but it's still magnetic, which was a strange idea at the time. So a lot of theories in physics suggested that you couldn't have a 2D magnet. In fact, Kosterlitz in our department came up with theories that would say that you wouldn't be able to do that. But it turns out that you can have literally atomically thin layers that are magnets. Because of the fact that there tend to be different kinds of what we call anisotropy. So there are little distortions in the 2D material that make it not perfectly 2D at the electronic level. And so you end up being able to have these kinds of magnets. So it's like a little thin layer, like it's not graphene, but of the scale of graphene layer as a magnet. And so it can be a ferromagnet in its monolayer form. So just one layer is a ferromagnet. But if you put one layers together, you get an antiferromagnet. And then if you go to three, you get a ferromagnet again. So we wanted to understand this. The first experiments on the monolayer were done in about 2018. So we wanted to understand exactly what's going on here. And just to show you why we care about the methods that we'll show you, so DFT can be used on this material. And so, of course, we did. It's a very quick method, so you can use it on any material. And we wanted to predict what's the magnetism, what's the magnetic moment in this material. And so here, what I show you is in these different colors, I have different density functionals. So the easiest density functional is called LDA. That was the first one. That's in brown. And then we have maybe the next most common functional. It's called PBE. It's a little bit better. I can go into the details. And we can put on what's called a U term. A U is just an electron repulsion. And as we grow that U, we can get different curves. And so what you see is that as we change these functionals, we can basically get any answer we want. Turns out that we know if we have the 3D material, we know exactly what moment it should have. We can measure it. 3D material, you can go in the lab and measure. And you see that these curves are just kind of increasing steadily from the DFT. And so that basically means that you could get any answer you want for what that moment is if you had no background answer. And this is very common. Mean field theories will give you an answer, and it's not necessarily a bad answer, but sometimes you have no idea if it's right or wrong. And so that's kind of what this plot is showing. And you see the same things for other different properties. So if you want to look at the lattice constant, which tells you how big the material is, you get the same thing. So we used better theories, the quantum Monte Carlo theories I'll talk about in a minute to actually pin down exactly what the magnetism is. We actually found that it has a much bigger magnetic moment than expected. So the chromiums, a lot of people thought they should have a magnetic moment of 3 just based on simple chemical considerations. It actually has a much bigger moment according to our exact calculations. So that's just an example. But if we want to solve things exactly historically, what that means is solving the Schrodinger equation. And like I said, as Dirac pointed out, we can write this equation down, but it's really hard to solve. And so if you wanted to solve this exactly to go beyond DFT, you would have to write out all the states. So for anybody who's ever taken a physics class, you probably know the technique. It's called exact diagonalization. That's the exact method we use in quantum mechanics. What that method does is it says write down all the states, and then you make a Hamiltonian, and then you diagonalize it to get the energy and other properties. So you can do that. You can absolutely do that. But the problem is that it breaks the bank. So if I want to consider, let's say, one state, one orbital, and put electrons in it up and down, I'd get just one overall state if I have that situation. But let's say I have two orbitals or two states, and I want to put the electrons in those different orbitals. Now I end up with 4 states, and then if you want to put 2 electrons in 3 orbitals, I get 9 states, and then it just keeps blowing up. And so that's the fundamental part of this electronic structure problem. If you want the exact answer, it blows up exponentially. I mean, technically combinatorially with the number of orbitals and the number of electrons. And so that prevents us from using exact diagonalization, exact methods, except for the smallest systems possible. Basically, if you have more than a few atoms, you're just done. You cannot possibly do it. And so we've had to come up with new methods over the years that are exact, but also fast. And so here I make a little plot. This was one of my one of my thesis committee members, Richard Friesner at Columbia. He's probably most famous for his company, which is called haphazardly Schrodinger. So this is the biggest molecular and material simulation company in the United States and perhaps the world at this point. And he's funded by Bill Gates and others. And so he made this company. And so what he used to tell us is there's always conservation of annoyance in quantum mechanics. The idea is that you could solve things exactly like I was just talking about, but it has exponential cost. Or you could solve things cheaply, maybe using mean field theories like density functional theory, but they're not right. They're not going to tell you everything you need. So you're always just annoyed as a result of that. And so what we try to do is we try to look for things in the sweet spot between maybe not too computationally expensive, but also not too inaccurate. And so one set of methods that do that are called quantum Monte Carlo methods, and that's what we'll show you the notebook for. So I don't want to talk for too much, but I'll give you a little bit of introduction to what those methods are, why they work, and then I'll let Ken go into the notebook with you. Um, Before I get into that, one thing I should also say, so some of you may be asking, like, what are the best methods out there? If you wanted to do material simulations, what should you do? Well, DFT is good and cheap, and everybody should know it if you just want to like look at experiments and understand maybe what's going on at a basic level. But if you really want to understand problems, there are really two sets of leading methods, in my personal opinion, for physics. So those would be quantum Monte Carlo methods. They give you very accurate things, but they come with a cost, which we'll talk about. But there are also things called tensor network methods. So people might have heard of DMRG or matrix product states. So tensor network states are another set of methods I won't talk about today. We also work on them, and some other people at Brown work at them. Those QMC and tensor network states are probably the two leading methods. QMC deals with things from the perspective of sampling, and tensor networks deal with things from the perspective of entanglement. And so if you look at modern papers, those are probably the two suites of methods that you're really seeing to solve accurate problems. All right, so let me tell you a little bit about Monte Carlo, and then I'll leave it to Ken. Again, I don't want to talk too much. Please let me know if you have any questions. If anybody has any questions, maybe I'll take a pause right now. Okay, I'll talk a little bit about Monte Carlo, and then I'll talk a little bit about quantum Monte Carlo. So for those of you who are not familiar with Monte Carlo is what we call a stochastic algorithm. It's an algorithm that uses random numbers to get different properties. And so a lot of people are familiar with what we call classical Monte Carlo. Classical Monte Carlo, it was really devised by Rosenbluth, Teller, and Metropolis. That was the key paper, at least. And you might ask why Rosenbluth, and Teller. Well, they work with their wives, who were the first computers at Los Alamos. So their wives were also on the paper. So that's why you got double names. And so Monte Carlo methods are methods where we use random numbers to sample different kinds of integrals, typically. And these integrals come up in a lot of settings. So if you've ever thought, maybe if you ever took a physics class where you thought about spin models, so maybe the Ising model, or you ever took a physics or chemistry class where you looked at fluids, a lot of times if you want to figure out what these things are doing at temperature, you have to look at their partition functions. And usually you can write those partition functions as integrals. And so in Monte Carlo, what we do is we use random numbers to sample those integrals. And so if you don't care about basic physical models, what I'll tell you is it's also very important in biology. The same kinds of methods are used to understand proteins and RNAs and so forth. Really, Monte Carlo is named after the Monte Carlo Casino in Monaco. And Stanislav Ulam was someone who would frequently visit that casino, and he helped develop that method that then others like Rosenbluth and Teller and so forth developed into computational frameworks as part of the Manhattan Project. They were interested in sampling things really for nuclear calculations. The idea is, let's say you have a function, and this function goes up and down, could be any function, and you want to understand maybe what the average of that function is, or maybe you want to integrate under the curve. So what you can do if you want to integrate that function is you could use what we call standard numerical quadrature, which maybe if you took like AP calculus, even then you learned it. This is just basically taking points and drawing little trapezoids or rectangles to add up the integral. So I can divide this integral into a bunch of little pieces, then I can calculate the area of those pieces, and then add all of those pieces together, and then get the full integral. So that's called quadrature. And that's a great method, and there are lots of different shapes you can draw and kind of techniques you can use in order to do that quadrature. But it turns out this quadrature is very expensive in high dimensions. So if you think about a wave function or a material, it's got a whole bunch of dimensions. It can have millions of dimensions for where all of its atoms and electrons can be. So then this quadrature becomes really hard because you've got to make these little grids, all these little lines in, let's say, a million dimensions. So, just do the combinatorics. If you have a million dimensions and you maybe divide your function along each axis into 5 pieces, well, then that's 5 to a million, which is too much, way too impossible. And so this quickly becomes intractable. In fact, at 8 dimensions, it no longer becomes the best way of doing things. So what we do instead in Monte Carlo is we sample different places of this function. So we say maybe at coordinate x0, x2, x3, what's the value of the function? We get those values, and then we average them. And then that gives us the integral overall. Now, you could do this bare averaging, where you just take random points. But if you do so just bare, it may be very difficult to converge. So we do a lot of tricks to actually make this faster, which I won't go into here, but I'm happy to talk about. So people do this all the time. If you want to figure out, the area of a circle, you might have heard this problem before. What you can do is you can make a square and then throw dots at the square. And then you can figure out the area of the circle by just counting the proportion of dots in the circle versus outside the circle. So that's one way of using Monte Carlo, the random throwing of darts at a place. That's stochastic modeling. You can also get the area of different, crazy shapes, Batman, Mandelbrot set, whatever you want to do, also using this kind of sampling. So people do this, and so this has given rise to what we call quantum Monte Carlo. So I won't go through all the algorithmic details for the sake of time, but the idea is we can do exactly the same thing for quantum properties. And what's nice about this, again, it's faster than quadrature. If you want to do an integral and make little boxes, that's really expensive, it turns out. So it's faster than quadrature, but it can give you a whole bunch of different properties. So the idea of quantum Monte Carlo is instead of sampling like random spins or random positions of particles, you can instead sample random components of the wave function. And it turns out that there are a bunch of different ways of doing this. We'll show you one way. I guess I was the mother or father of a different way of doing this way back in the day. But the first ideas of this also started at Los Alamos in Livermore. I guess one of my postdoc collaborators, Bernie Alder, who won the National Medal of Science, he wrote one of the first papers on this, although it was around before that. People were talking about that for a while. So what they did back in the day is they said, why don't we find a way of sampling integrals that will solve the Schrodinger equation for us? Since then, there have been lots and lots of different methods developed. I guess I'm famous for auxiliary field quantum Monte Carlo, but today we'll talk about variational Monte Carlo for the most part. So why would you want to do this? And then we'll get into the notebooks. Again, we want to do this because if you solve material properties exactly, they scale exponentially. So you can't solve problems with more than a few particles that way. If you want to solve things using density functional theory, it has a nice scaling. So if you know computational complexity, we talk about an n cube scaling, meaning if you have, I'll say n electrons, but I can put an asterisk on that. If you have n electrons, this is going to scale as the cube of the number of electrons, but that's approximate, doesn't give you the right answer. There are some other methods out there that are really good, but still they have a pretty high scaling, n to the 7th. Some people may ask if you ever heard of GW methods in physics. They're actually the same as couple cluster. You can show that theoretically. They scale very high as well. And so we want something that can give us a high accuracy answer, but at lower cost. So quantum Monte Carlo ends up being about n cubed or faster. But it has one issue, which is called the sign problem. We won't get into it today, but it has this pesky thing where you can end up sampling negative probabilities. So people like me have to deal with that. So it gives us a low scaling method to get things right. And then the other reason why we want to use these methods is because they use random sampling is that they're highly parallel. So for some of these methods, so this n to the seventh method, for example, a lot of methods are deterministic, meaning they don't sample, they don't have random numbers. If you put them on a computer, it's really hard to break them up because they don't use random numbers. You have to do like one big calculation, and that's a huge problem. In our kinds of calculations, we can break up the problem. So since we use random numbers, we can basically sample parts of the problem on whole bunches of different computers and then bring the whole thing back together. We like to use very big computers, but actually you don't have to. You can use small computers and many, big computers and a few. You can break it up in different ways. So that's why we like to use these methods. Um, so what the notebook's going to go into, and Ken will take you through the notebook, and you can do some exercises, and I'll walk through things too, is he'll show you one such method, and then we'll show you how to use ML on that method. So there are lots of different ways ML is being inserted into the pipeline, like I talked about at the beginning. What we're going to show you is because these methods are based on random numbers, they produce quantities that have error bars, random error bars. So if you want to figure out something about a material using these methods, you have to do some averaging to get over those error bars. So what Ken's going to show you is we've been trying to figure out ways to get around all that averaging. So, we're taking samples and maybe we don't want to average for the age of the universe. How can we maybe not do so much averaging? And so what we're going to show you is how could you use machine learning to get rid of some of that noise. And I know you did some examples that are kind of similar to this earlier in the physics school, and so we are kind of connecting to those. So one way of denoising is using convolutional neural networks, which people, I think you saw used in astrophysics, and you can also use them in other areas. Other ways of denoising are using standard denoising methods that people have used for image analysis for a long time. So we'll show you how you can use ML to maybe cut through some of this noise a little bit faster to get to the kinds of answers that you want. Okay, so I'm going to take a quick pause. Does anybody have any questions about this or other things before we jump into the notebook?
And again, I'll highlight to use the Q&A feature to ask questions.
Okay, we'll just transition. Ken, I don't know if you want me to bring up the notebook or you can bring it up. It's up to you.
I can bring it up just so I can scroll around it as needed.
Sure.
While Ken is bringing up the notebook, you should all have a link in your Google Drive, in the shared drive section to the folder where the notebooks are. Um, Again, put in the Q&A if you have issues accessing the Google Drive. And because you only have read access to that notebook, you should make a copy. And if you right click on the actual notebook, you should be able to get an option to make a local copy on your own Google Drive and therefore run the notebook and edit anything you want there.
Yeah, just a few more comments on that. So there's some supplementary files that you'll find in the folder, and you'll have to make sure to upload those to your current runtime, because whenever you start a new runtime in Colab, it will remove those files. And then another thing, we're gonna have to switch to and I'll probably just leave the cells that are ran as is, but if you want to run it, I would suggest connecting to a runtime that has the so you can see here I'm connected to a T4 GPU. If you're not on a GPU, and I have a check down later that checks whether or not there is a GPU detected, the convolutional neural network is going to take a much longer time to train. So it is a very short number of epochs that we train this model for, just for the sake of time. But if you're trying to train and it's taking a very long time, it's likely because the runtime you're connected to is not a GPU accelerated runtime. So I think most of this overview has been touched on by Brenda, but I'll kind of give you an overview from my research perspective about the exact goal of this project. So we know that we can introduce this noise into our properties by using these quantum Monte Carlo methods. So one thing we notice, and one thing that motivated this project, was that, say you have a camera, and the how a camera works, the sensor on a digital camera essentially picks up the number of electrons and puts them in a bin. And what you can do is you can, do a couple things very similar to how the quantum Monte Carlo methods work. We can do a long exposure and collect more light and get more information, and then that'll help us resolve exactly what the image is showing. Another thing we can do is use denoising methods. So say on your iPhone or whatever phone, you took a picture and it was very blurry. The iPhone has software in it that does different denoising algorithms in order to give you a higher resolution or more resolved image. Um, so this basically motivates us trying this on noisy electronic densities. So in the case of our electronic densities, we are do we get a chat? In the case of the electronic densities, we're doing a quantum Monte Carlo simulation, and we bin the probability of having the electrons in different boxes, and we see how much of the electrons. So in a specific system, say for example, in this case, we have an electronic density with a total of 8 electrons for the unit cell for carbon diamond, and so the distribution of those electrons are over these bins. In this case, they're cubes. So exactly how can we get from this image analog and use these image type models to denoise the electronic densities? And in turn, what we can do is we can do less sampling in quantum Monte Carlo, and then we can run a denoising algorithm. And what that'll do is give us a higher level of sampling from a less computationally intense calculation. So I believe I've basically touched on the objectives here. So yeah, I'll just read this. That the material electronic density is equivalent to the probability with which you would find an electron in a position across the material. So we provide all the files, and so you'll just have to upload those to the runtime. Exactly what these files are. So we have in these methods, in these quantum Monte Carlo methods, we have to use a trial wave function. You can use different trial wave functions. In this case, what we can do is we can take the density functional theory wave function, and in this case, we take the electronic density from that. And what this trial wave function does is, when we're doing our Monte Carlo integration, and we kind of touch on that, you'll see analogs from the Brenda's talk. Essentially, what we can do with that is it allows us to do our sampling. So if we were to do a numerical integration, or if we were to use Monte Carlo integration, what we need is a test function to basically tell us, all right, where in the sense of sampling, where should these samples be coming from? So if I sampled over all space, it would take a very long time to converge this integral. So what we have is this test function that basically allows us to sample in regions that are very similar. And so we introduce this thing called the local energy, and that allows us to sample the energy and perform our stochastic method here. So this density functional theory file here, we're going to use this actually. So this was used for the trial wave function, and we're going to use the electronic density. And instead of performing a large sample on the fly here from a Monte Carlo technique, we're going to do Monte Carlo-like sampling on the DFT density to create a training data set. And what that'll allow us to do is to provide the network with clean examples and noisy examples, and then we'll be able to use those to see how close to the VMC reference we're getting, and that'll allow us to parameterize our our neural network model. And I'll go into some details about exactly what that neural network model is. So the VMC reference here is a clean example, and it's going to be the target. We're going to use the DFT data, the DFT electronic density. We're going to introduce noise into that. And our goal is to get as close to this VMC reference, but we're not going to use that as our test set. What we're going to use is for our validation set, we're going to use this actual sample from VMC. So instead of having the overall reference, we take some sample. Actually, this is going to be for testing. We're going to take this sample here, and we're going to see how close our model is. And I'll show you a machine learning method that we've implemented in the notebook and a traditional image denoising method. So yeah, this is a lot of what Brenda has already gone over. Brenda, do you have any other notes on this earlier section?
Yeah, maybe I don't want to kill people with details, but we're just kind of writing out what these methods are. We're using, as Ken said, a method called variational Monte Carlo. This is the simplest quantum Monte Carlo method. It's also one of the hottest ones in machine learning because it turns out you can make a variational wave function out of a neural network itself. We didn't do that here, but you could. The idea here, so you see on the screen that you can evaluate the energy, and that's we'll call it a functional of psi, which is the wave function, and that wave function is a function of a bunch of parameters. So you can evaluate the energy if you know quantum mechanics. That's your expression for the energy that you've probably seen a million times. It turns out we can, these are exactly integrals, so that's great. So we can sample them using Monte Carlo. So if this wave function has a lot of parameters, then maybe we want to use it, sample it using Monte Carlo. So we can evaluate these different integrals and we can turn them into a probability distribution by making a few little quick moves. But the basic idea is that if you know quantum mechanics, psi squared is basically a probability amplitude. So we just try to rewrite this integral in terms of psi squared. And then we can sample that psi squared to give us the right wave function, and then that gives us the energy. Now in VMC, what we do is it's called variational Monte Carlo. VMC is variational Monte Carlo. It's a method where we try to change these parameters theta, so these thetas are parameters, until we get to the wave function that gives us the lowest energy. And if you've taken quantum mechanics in a physics department, you probably know there's something called the variational principle that says that the best wave function, the one that's closest to the true wave function, is the wave function that lowers the energy the most. And so maybe if you took that in class when I was an undergraduate, I'm like, that's a nice silly thing. Why would I ever use that? Well, the reason why you'd use that is that theorem actually says now you can guess a whole bunch of wave functions with different parameters, and then just like kind of change those parameters until you get to the lowest energy wave function, and that's your best wave function. So it's a great way to find your best quantum wave function without doing too much work. So that's why we use this variational method. So in variational Monte Carlo, we'll sample integrals to get the energy. And we can also technically sample derivatives, much like in machine learning, that will lower the energy of our wave function. So the way you can think about it, if you know machine learning, is in machine learning, you're usually trying to reduce your cost function, a cost function of some type by changing parameters. It's the same idea here, except our cost function is the energy. So we try to do parameter updates, and we have to evaluate some integrals for parameter updates as well. So we use variational Monte Carlo to do that. And then we do some basic derivatives to vary the parameters until we get to the lowest energy possible wave function. So that's what I wanted to say there. Feel free to work through the math or the references if you really care about the details. Maybe one other thing before Ken continues. I know there was a question in the chat. If somebody wants to raise that question, maybe you can put it in the chat. I think that's the only way I can get it. Okay, maybe that person disappeared. We'll figure it out. Okay, maybe Ken, you can go on.
Okay. Yeah, and just for everybody's reference, there, like I said, there's trial wave functions, and the these other methods that we use as trial wave functions can also be variational. So not only is variational quantum Monte Carlo a variational method, but also there are other variational methods. This one is able to treat electronic correlation, whereas other methods treat it not as well, like DFT, or not at all, like Hartree-Fock. So yeah, just to begin here, as I hinted at earlier, you're going to import all these things, and you're going to check if you have a GPU just to make sure that the calculation is going to have some sort of speed to it. And yeah, we're gonna basically start by yeah, this just goes over kind of what I just talked about. You got to make sure that you have all the files inside of your current runtime. And yeah, so in this case, we're just reading in the H5 file, the H5 electronic density files. So you have the DFT, the VMC reference, and the test example that we're going to show how the performance is between the image model and our denoising model. And in this function here, what we're going to do is we're going to introduce this method, the stochastic density method. And essentially n here is going to be the number of bins that we start to distribute the electrons from. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our DFT electronic density. We're going to treat that in some sense as a probability distribution. And we're going to take the total electron count from that, and we're going to put it into n bins. And what that's going to allow us to do is it's going to allow us to get, so in the way that we sample in this function, so this Poisson sampling right here, what this is going to do is it's going to take our DFT, and without running a Monte Carlo simulation, we're going to get DMC, so diffusion Monte Carlo like electronic densities from this. And that'll just allow us to efficiently generate data, and try to, the goal is to take a sample that has a signal in it, and we need to train this model to recognize what the noise structure is like so that we can remove that. So then we move on to actually generating the data sets. So in this case, what we do is actually, we're going to take this cube of points. So we have a 3D tensor here. We're going to minorize the sample, because if you know the structure of images, you have some resolution. You know, say it's your monitor might be 1920 by 1080 pixels. So we have some resolution, and then we have our color channels, so RGB. So what we need to do is we need to reconstruct our 3D tensor. And in this case, we just sum over the final axis. So basically the electrons were distributed in a cube, and now they're in a plane. And so we're gonna, to generate the 2D data set, we're going to take the electronic density from DFT. We're going to set some sampling level. And in this case, I do it over a range of 5 different, so I just, do it over some range that's, 1 to 5 times the current sampling level, just to give it some variation. Here we set a sample size, so the number of training and the number of validation samples. You can, if you want to run this, you can increase these numbers and see how well the model performs. So obviously, with a more limited data set, the model will perform not as well. And with a complete description of all the data, you should be able to have a model that fully describes whatever behavior you're trying to represent. So basically, I'm in this case, what I do is I have some different set of noise levels, and I choose randomly between those noise levels. So that's all this line here is doing. So I do an NP random choice in order to mix together different noise levels. So here at the top is different sampling levels and then different noise levels. And then for the validation data set here, what we do is basically what we do is we just increase the number of samples for this Y val. And all I do is I take the sampling level and I increase it by 10 times. So essentially I have my training data set and then I have my Y train. So this is going to be the less noisy version of the training data set. And this is so that the model sees what a cleaner version is and what a noisier version is. So all we do is we multiply this by 10 times the number of samples, and that gives it a less noisy image. Another thing that a user in this notebook can do is change this value and see what the difference is in training and deployment of the model that we'll see later on. And then here I have a test data set, but in this case, I provided you guys with an actual VMC sample that you can use this model to denoise and see how well it denoises it. So yeah, I kind of already talked about this, but we need to convert the electronic densities to and from RGB images. So you could imagine that if I was to create an RGB image of an electronic density, I need a mapping back to an electronic density if I were to use that to derive any physical properties or even just inspect how well that's doing. So that's exactly what this function does. Essentially, it just takes our electronic density and it simply encodes it into an RGB image with 3 channels. And then here is just the function to bring it back into an electronic density. And what we need to do is we need to ensure that the total electron count after converting back is correct. So in this case, if you were to do this with a different system, your target number of electrons would have to be the sum over all axes of your original electronic density. So in this case, I've coded it to 8 because in our carbon diamond unit cell, we have 8 electrons. This cell right here is just a check to ensure that the number of electrons is correct and that when we take a sample and just simply encode and then decode it, that nothing changes. So this is just checking that the function is working correctly. If this absolute difference here was very large, it would indicate that we've not reconstructed the original matrix correctly. So yeah, you'll be able to use this later in order to determine how much we've denoised the original electronic density that we encoded as an image. So yeah, this is just in this cell, all we're doing is we're taking our data sets that we generated and encoding them into the actual, so we generated data sets and now we need to put them into the image structures. So we just run our function that we define there. And here is just a visual representation of what a noisy sample looks like now versus the actual VMC reference. So ideally, we'd get as close as possible to this VMC reference. And right now, what we're going to be training a model on looks like this right image here. So yeah, I don't think I missed any questions that were in set. Let me just, oh, there is. Yeah, so maybe I'll ask this question. How do convolutional neural networks work? And I'm assuming people will just answer in the chat. What is a UMAP and how do they differ?
Yeah, please, if you've been following through, also it'd be useful to find out if anyone has actually managed to run a few of the steps, having copied the notebooks, just to make sure that there aren't any file path issues.
I know the chat is somewhere. Oh, there it is. Why don't we, while we wait, I'll just should be connected to runtime here. I can just run some of the cells and then just make sure that sometimes Colab takes a while to run, so we'll just run the things we've talked about so far just to make sure that things are working well. Not seeing any questions yet. So the generation of the data will take a little bit of time, and the training of the model takes a little bit of time. But overall, this notebook runs quickly. You can easily change things. But as long as you imported these files here, everything should be running just as it is here. So it's working for me, which I made it, so it usually works for the person who made it. But yeah, I'm not seeing anybody chime in yet. I don't know if we should wait another minute.
Again, so someone says it runs well. Again, the trick is if you've made a local copy, I believe the references are to the local copies of also the files. So you need to copy all four files to your local drive. So if you're running into an error that it's not finding the density functional inputs.
Yeah, if you look over on the left and you don't see all the files, you just got to download them and upload them.
And again, it's the same procedure as for copying the notebook. By default, it'll end up in the same place. If for the winter school, we had this uh, procedure where you'd create them into separate modules, but to be honest, it doesn't actually need for them to be in different modules because the file names are all different between the different modules anyways, so you won't overwrite anything.
Yep, yep. Yeah, I don't know why when you show it, if you went into a Google Drive folder and you right-clicked it, you can say open in Colab, but for some reason it doesn't recover all the files in the folder. It would be nice if it did, but
It would be nice if Google allowed you to copy an entire folder rather than copying files, but
yeah,
that's a separate issue.
yeah.
Thank you for the attendees. Has anyone tried changing the amount of the data that's the number of samples? Um, it's probably only recommended if someone has access to one of the GPUs because it could get really slow if you increase the number of samples.
So maybe Ken, do you want to take different, what are CNNs, which I think they've heard about earlier, versus let's say UNets, and why you're using those?
CNNs versus UNets. Yeah. Maybe I'll just Um, yeah. So basically, in a normal convolutional neural network, you'll be able to have these filters. So what you can have is these filters go over the images, and extract out your features. And that is good and well, but what ends up happening is either you're going to directly learn the exact noise and just overfit to that noise and reproduce that. Um, so basically what a UNet will allow us to do, and we'll see this in a second, is, and maybe I think I'll describe this in a second, is basically we're gonna have a connection between the encoder and the decoder. So in this case, we're in a convolutional neural network. You normally have a stacking of filters, and what that'll do is it'll get finer and finer features out of the image. In the case of our UNet in a convolutional autoencoder, what we'll have is an encoder to get to some latent space where our image is just the most important part of the signal. And then the decoder will only retain that most important part of the signal and bring us back to the full size image. In the UNet, what we do is we connect the decoder to the encoder, and we ensure that we basically are trying to ensure that we're not removing too much signal. So when we're doing our denoising, what you could do is completely, like, for example, in a worst case scenario, uh, the model detects that everything is noise and just gives us one flat color. By using these connections, what we allow the model to do is have some context and get some idea of what is being thrown away at each layer as we do our bottlenecking, and that allows us to make sure that we're not throwing away signal, or to optimize the amount of signal that is retained. So ideally, we get rid of only the noise and none of the signal, but with a limited data set, you're always going to have some issues related to this. So yeah. Oh, well, yeah. With this image here, you can get an idea of exactly what's happening. So with the skip connection here, so we have our convolutional layers, and we have this bottlenecking, which is, you can imagine like a funnel, decreasing the image down to a certain latent space, and so in this bottleneck here, we'll have just the most important features. And what these skip connections will allow us to do is connect our encoder to our decoder and allow us to recover some of that information and then reconstruct the image. So if we didn't have that, basically we could end up with a situation where we just ended up with, say, a white square, because it said, all right, I don't know what this is, but it looks like a cell of some sort. This cell is all noise. Whereas with the method, we're able to say, all right, there is some signal here. Let's make sure we retain that signal. So yeah, I mean, I kind of just answered this question, but yeah, I think I'll just, should I wait for answers for this question maybe? If somebody wants to reiterate what I just said in the chat, what is the difference between a normal CNN or a convolutional autoencoder and a UNet architecture? So you can see the UNet architecture here. So yeah, if somebody wants to give me a short synopsis, that would be great.
It's a little complicated because, of course, they can't speak, so
Yeah, I know.
make it short. Uh, but if someone has comments to make, put them in the Q&A.
Yeah. Just give it a minute.
Let me also ask if anyone has actually successfully run through the training step for the UNet and gotten a picture. Does it look anything like the picture that Ken showed?
Yeah, I can even just run those cells while we're waiting. And even if anybody has any questions about the architecture, I would say ask them. And if you want to answer what is the structure of the UNet below, feel free to do that just based on the cell. So I should be on the GPU. Let's make sure. Yeah. Yeah, so if I wasn't on a GPU, this would take like 5 minutes per epoch. So at this rate, what we can see here is we have our loss function, and yeah, so maybe I'll go through the architecture a little bit. So So essentially, what we start with is this reflective padding. And in this reflective padding, what this allows us to do is, say we had padding, we didn't use reflective padding. What you end up getting in images, at least in practice, doing this project, is that at the edges, you just essentially get a box around the image. So ideally, what we'd have is that those edges of the images are correctly represented, obviously. But if you use padding equals same, what you end up getting is a line of zeros around the edge, because at the edge of the image, you have your filters going over it, and it's using padding equals same. And what that does is it just says, all right, there's nothing here. So when I go to make a prediction, it ends up putting in some visual artifacts. So what we do is we end up having reflective padding. So we have our convolution over the image, and we look at the edges for the convolution, and we just reflect back what the image sees. And this ends up helping getting rid of artifacts, especially in the case where you have these kind of defined structures, I guess, that are also noisy. So this first part here is the reflective 2D padding. If we were to switch to a full three-dimensional representation, we would have to make this function 3D. But the point in this case is to show how well image models work for these cases. And what you can actually do is just take your full cube and just slice it into images, and then run this whole platform on it. And that's essentially what we do to check how well it can reconstruct a full electronic density. In this case, this function here is just a normalization function. And that just ensures that things are staying within a certain region. This is us applying the reflective padding. That's our call function up there, and how we're doing our padding exactly. So this is a custom padding function. If you run TensorFlow, you can just use their built-in padding functions and see how well they work. And then here is just the simple unit, and you can change all these parameters however you'd like. But essentially, we have our encoder, where we downsample our image to a certain level, and you can change the number of neurons in each of these layers. And then we essentially, once our bottleneck is done, we basically we go to our decoder, and what that's going to do is it's going to our decoder is gonna bring us back to the full image resolution size. So we can change a lot of different things if you want to mess around with these functions. Specifically how we're doing our activation and introducing our nonlinearity into the neural networks. You can change the padding. And then in the end, we just return the outputs from all those steps. And then these steps here are just for training. What optimizer are we using? In this case, it's Atom. The loss is going to be the mean absolute error. And then here, these things are a little more, these aren't necessary exactly. But what early stopping does is it watches the training and validation curves. And if things end up plateauing, this will just stop your function. So what you can do, I ran it for 5 epochs for the sake of time. But ideally what you do is you'd set this to something like 200 epochs. You let the training go. And what early stopping will do is you don't have to go through all 200 epochs if you see that things have plateaued significantly. You can see here that we've gone from 0.2 to 0.05 to 0.04, and things are continuing to decrease. And at some point, this would level out. And so you see our loss and our validation loss, which are both decreasing. If we see a big increase in the validation loss, say, you'd use early stopping, or if you see a plateau, so that we're not just wasting compute time So this just ensures that um, this ensures two things. It ensures that we're not wasting compute and we're just outputting things if nothing's changing. We also use a learning rate scheduler here. So what this does is, like I was saying, this reduce on plateau function. If I do see that the learning rate is plateau, or the loss is plateauing, I can decrease our learning rate. And what that'll do is, say we had some curve that was the our cost function. If our learning rate is too high, we're just bouncing potentially between 2 points on that curve as we're performing gradient descent. So if we can decrease that learning rate, we can start to take smaller steps down towards that minima, and it helps us get the best function we can. You can adjust these other things also. So batch size and number of epochs is probably the most obvious one. So yeah, this quickly ran the 5 epochs. And then down here, I guess I can just run all these. So this first box here is just us taking the electronic density, taking our test electronic density and encoding it. And then this one right here is going to be us running so if you do unet.predict, we just take our neural network and we use it to make a prediction on our test example here. And then yeah, so what we've done is we've encoded, we've predicted, and then we decode back to an electronic density. And then here we show exactly what the images look like. So if I run this again, I don't know why that last example had some weird artifacts in it, but you can see this was the noisy projection. So we took this sample, this noisy projection here, we input it into our U model and made our UNet model and made a prediction, and that looks like this. And our reference here is on the right. So how does this perform compared to a normal image model? A normal image model. So in this case, we're going to compare to a simple method. And here's another caveat for your runtime, which I'll get going now. You'll have to install this method to compare it, which takes a few seconds. And sometimes you have to restart your kernel. But this method's called BM3D, which is just block matching and 3D filtering. Yeah, and this is a good representation of exactly how it works. So essentially, it takes blocks over the image, and it compares those blocks. Basically, it compares similarities between those blocks. And then we do something like a Fourier filtering, where we're going to see what is high frequency and what is low frequency in this Fourier space. I believe I'll have to look back at the documentation, but I believe they use a fast Fourier transform, but it might be something different. But yeah, basically what they try to determine is, say we have adjacent blocks. We try to relate those adjacent blocks using this block matching, and then we perform a filtering on those blocks to try to just get rid of the noise. And this model shows pretty good success. Obviously, if this was the noisy image and this is the clean version, that looks really good. But how does it work for electronic density? So you can see in normal images, we have these very discrete separations. So like you have the sky here and you have the roof here. We want our electronic densities for the most part to be smooth. So while this image model looks like this, this model works well for these images where we have these very harsh edges. Will that actually translate to a model that does good denoising and electronic density? So again, you'd have to install BM3D. And then we can just run our BM3D model here. So we take in our RGB encoding of that test function, and some things you can adjust here. You can look into the parameters of the BM3D function, but you can adjust these parameters to whatever you want. And then we can decode back to an electronic density here in this line. And obviously we need to renormalize the number of electrons to 8, because when we encode it into an image, we have certain parameters that we change the image to. So there's different ways you can make an RGB image, but you can either have a float between 0 and 1 for the colors, or you can have it between 0 and 252, I think, integers. So yeah, in this case, we're doing a comparison of how BM3D looks compared to the reference, compared to the noisy input. And yeah, I just gave a little bit of the discussion on why this might not perform as well. The block matching might not be as obvious, I guess, in adjacent blocks here. And so we see our noisy projection, and the denoise version does seem to be smoothed, but it doesn't seem to be, it seems to have I guess, maybe a decent amount of artifacts here. So yeah, essentially, both of the methods, this is a very simple case where I showed a very small amount of data, but we can see that the UNet does a better job at giving something that's more like an electronic, or more like the reference electronic density than when we perform that an out of the box standard image denoising model. And so exactly how should we compare these things? So obviously I've been talking about just visually comparing, which isn't obvious, because if I showed you the DFT electronic density and this VMC reference, they look very similar. So exactly how should we compare these things? So what we can do is we can just treat them as a probability distribution. And what we'll have to do is we'll have to normalize them to 1. And we can use different things. For example, you may have heard of the KL divergence. And essentially what we can do is with this KL divergence, or this other divergence I'm showing here, the Jensen-Shannon divergence, is we can see how close these probability distributions are to each other. So if we had that the probability distributions are exactly the same, we see that the divergence of them will just be the log of 1, which equals 0. So obviously this means the closer the distributions are to each other, the closer to 0 we get. However, the KL divergence is unbounded. So if we want to use this as a test as a test function for training, say, things can end up blowing up, and we can end up having problems with exploding or vanishing gradients. So to help with this, and to give us a true distance metric into how far the distributions are apart, we switch to something that is based on the KL divergence, but it's called the Jensen-Shannon divergence. And we see here it's just 1/2 the KL divergence of the, basically. So essentially we have our distribution P, or distribution Q, and then we have M here, which is 1/2 P plus Q. So if we take the KL divergence of P given M and the KL divergence of Q given M, then what we get is something that is bounded at 0 if they're exactly the same again. However, the upper bound is just log base 2 of 2. And so this gives us a true distance metric. And this cell right here is just us encoding the KL divergence. what you'll have to make sure, and what you can just add if you need to, is that these things are true probability distributions. So you have to make sure that what you input, and that's what we ensured with the normalization in the neural network. But what you'll have to ensure, if you input something that's um, not necessarily a true probability distribution, is say like P1 equals P1 over NP dot sum P1. Um, so if you did that, that would ensure that we were normalizing to one and that we're comparing true probability distributions. In this case, we are fine, and we can check the KL divergence. And we see that using the Jensen-Shannon divergence is this 0.009 for our UNet compared to the noisy. So we have our so here we have our decoded UNet electronic density, and then here we have the reference. So if we take the Jensen-Shannon divergence between those two, we get this 0.009. Whereas if we use the normal image model from BM3D that's used for just denoising pictures, we see that we have a higher KL divergence of 0.015. Sorry, I think I already answered this, but we're very close to the end. So if somebody wants to add, why do we think, or which method do you think performs best, and why? I guess why would be the most interesting part. I'll wait a few minutes to see if somebody wants to answer that.
And similarly, if someone can confirm that they were able to get this far.
I did download this myself, just to make sure that it was exactly like everybody else was doing it. So it should work. This was not like a pre-downloaded version.
Yeah, I think one of my concerns is not everyone might have access to a GPU, so I'll be curious to see if anyone is stuck in CPU land.
Yeah, I don't know how they distribute these resources. But yeah, if you just go to change runtime and you switch CPU to T4 GPU, you should be fine. But it is possible that it fills up. I don't run on Codelab very much, so I don't.
Yeah, I think there are certain countries where it's difficult, and there are also certain times of day when uh, not every GPU option is available. In the meantime, while people are working, Ken, can I ask you a question? I know
Yeah.
it's a little unfair of me. Um, so in your denoising method, you could see in the analytic denoising method, you can see the sort of evidence of effectively a scale box size.
Yeah.
Um, could you get around this at the cost of computation by sort of taking variations over that?
You're saying in the BM in the block matching method?
That's right. The block matching, basically, there's a finite size to the block, and
Yeah.
you can see that imprinted in the output.
Mhm.
Um, Now, of course, you need to know the form of the problem. This is a problem. The reason I'm curious, this is a problem that shows up in astrophysics a lot, right? So you you first have to get an estimate of the size of objects, and then you know what the smoothing scale is for
Yeah.
something like this that will help denoise.
Yeah. Yeah. I think if you look at the documentation, I think they give some guidance, and I think that is a parameter you can adjust. So I don't know if this exactly adjusts the size of the box, but I think this portion here, this sigma here has something to do with it. I agree with you that if you change the size of the box, it might treat the problem better, depending on what the exact problem is. But this method is so something I guess I should say is that basically the gold standard for image denoising at this point is either attention aware or different versions of a UNet
Yeah.
architecture. So they really have, very similar, um, I guess, ideas behind them compared to this BM3D method. Um, but this is just a filtering method. Yeah. I don't think I exactly answered your question, but
No, that was basically it. I mean, again, one of the advantages of a UNet is that it figures out what sort of scale because it figures out what the signal is.
yeah, and there's just like many people have probably heard of like when the attention is all you need, when the transformer models came out, and these challenges that come out where they say, try to solve this problem. In image denoising, there are challenges exactly like that, where you go into some challenge and everybody submits their software, and whoever's does the best at denoising, I don't know what they get exactly. I guess just recognition, but this is a field where it's very important, obviously, to get uh, denoised images, especially with how much you have, driverless cars coming out, which I think the Teslas, I believe, only work on digital cameras. They no longer have, as far as I know, I think they removed their radar technology just for digital cameras. So you can imagine how important it's going to be to have, you know, these denoising algorithms and them be accurate. I'm sure they have their own bespoke software for that, but they're definitely using machine learning. So yeah, I'm not seeing anything in the chat. So
It's, so let me in the interest of time ask if anyone in the chat has gotten to the slot just before the divergence exercise. Thank you, anonymous attendee.
oh, there's
This
the
is one of
Q&A.
the downsides of this model of webinar is that the immediate feedback, even from like a raised thumb, is not available. So
Yeah,
thank you.
I didn't even know where the Q&A was until yeah. So I mean, the rest of these are just if this was more interactive, I guess we could go through these questions. But I think, yeah, like I guess I can just talk about alternative um,
I think before you
denoising.
talked about alternatives, can you give a couple pointers to things? Keep in mind that the attendees and even people who weren't able to attend this will have access to this notebook for a year. Uh, are there particular things that you recommend them playing with to see different effects?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, the most important thing, I think, if you really want to see different things happen, um, which is obviously the research grade portion of this, is you're going to need to run a VMC calculation and accumulate VMC noise, and then train a model on that and see if this DFT function is actually sufficient to help us um, generate the noise to train a model on. Um, if you want to just simply mess around with these notebooks, I would change the noise levels. So you can see in this image here how much noise there is, right? If I, you know, if I add much more sampling, we'll get much more to this VMC reference, and you can see how well the output is from the UNet by just doing much more sampling. So what'll end up happening is that your new UNet is gonna have in this case, the signal to noise ratio is so we have a very fine signal under a lot of noise. So what happens if we have not much noise and a very large signal? How does the model perform in that case? That's something we can simply test by just increasing n in our training. So if we change the sampling level to say 10,000, you're going to see a lot different performance. So I would suggest messing around with the number of samples. So the number of training samples here, the sampling level is important. And you can mess around with the encoding even, obviously. And then in terms of the model architecture, you can try the input padding functions that are in TensorFlow. In my experience, they didn't work well, so we just implemented a simple coding.
On
And
on
then
that note,
just
can
yeah,
so one of the things that often happens in these conditions is periodic boundary conditions. Is that a really bad idea in this case?
is periodic boundary conditions a bad idea in this case? Let me think about that. Um, yeah, I don't think it's bad. I guess the only thing you're gonna run into a problem where what we have here is we enforce a normalization. Um, and using periodic boundary conditions, exactly how you'd incorporate that normalization into the architecture, you just have to make sure that
Mm.
um, you're accounting for not knowing the exact number of electrons. Maybe it's obvious how you would do that. It's not obvious to me. Um, because essentially what I want the model to do is to say, I can change these pixel values by reducing the amount of noise in it. But I have to ensure that the total overall um, electronic density is correct. In that I have 8 electrons overall, the sum of overall voxels. Um, so yeah, I'm sure there's ways you can do that. Um,
All right. Thanks, Ken. I think now is probably a good time to get to the summaries.
yeah. Yes, essentially. So yeah, I guess I could discuss some alternative methods, but I think we've kind of talked about them. We're currently working on alternative methods that are more sophisticated than this, in various ways. Um, but yeah, if you go into the literature, there's different kinds of architectures that use, say, transformers, in order to get more context out of exactly what the images are. Um, and yeah, and so yeah, I'll just go through the conclusion. So in this notebook, we basically showed how to take DFT electronic density, introduce noise into that electronic density using a similar sampling method to how the electronic density would be sampled using Monte Carlo methods. And then we created data sets that we could train a convolutional neural network on, in this case, a UNet. And what that allowed us to do was to efficiently generate data, because the cost of the DFT is less than the cost of the VMC. And especially the VMC, I'll give the caveat, especially of the VMC using Jastrow factors, which is how we introduce electronic correlation. And so what this allows us to do is to efficiently train a model that allows us to perform our denoising. Um, and and then what we can do is we can take a lower sample VMC and we can denoise that with this model. And this allows us to create a more accurate electronic density that's closer to the true long time sample VMC, just by taking an early sample in the process of running a QMC calculation, running our denoising model that's trained on DFT, and then we have a more accurate electronic density. So yeah, if anybody has any questions or wants to reach out to me or Brenda or anybody else about these projects, yeah.
Okay, last chance to ask questions. You will have access to the modules, so you can play with things a lot. And obviously, some of these references are good places to read more on this. Going once. Well, thank you, Brenda. Thank you, Ken. I wanted to remind people that we will start up again at 2 p.m. Uh, James Vervis will talk about reinforcement learning and using reinforcement learning as a way to learn classical mechanics, in this case, orbital transfers. So thank
Thanks,
you
everyone.
all.
Have a good day.